I am Inspector, and I solve mystery. Welcome to my new case.
The evening had been one of those Oxford nights when the rain drifts rather than falls, misting the stones with a sheen that makes them look older still. I had taken refuge in a corner of the Jericho Tavern, half watching the amber glow of the lamps against the glass, half reading the crossword that refused to yield to me. The third pint was half drunk, and I felt no particular urge to finish it. Solitude was never unwelcome company. It was Strange who disturbed me, though it was Lewis's voice I heard. A hat had been left behind at St. Barnabas after an alumni dinner, and the man who had hung it there had failed to return. At first glance, it sounded like a matter for a lost property office, not a detective inspector. But the porter, a fellow of meticulous habits, insisted that the absence was peculiar. One guest had vanished into the wet Oxford night, leaving behind the trilby that was as much his signature as his handshake. I walked to the college rather than call for a car. The streets were empty, but for the hiss of tires on wet cobblestone and the occasional laughter of students lingering outside pubs. The college itself stood solemn, doors closed, light spilling only faintly from a window where a graduate might be translating something he scarcely understood. The porter met me at the gate, a man built on quiet routines. He guided me through the cloisters to the cloakroom where damp coats hung heavily, smelling faintly of tobacco and rain. The trilby was waiting. It had the weary dignity of an object long in service, the felt worn thin at the crown, the lining stitched and restitched by a hand not particularly skilled, and a faint mark where fingers had lifted it countless times. I lifted it myself, turning it under the light. There was a crease not of manufacture, but of habit, an indentation where a thumb had pressed down too firmly. The porter muttered that the owner had arrived punctually, hung his hat on the rack, and gone into the hall where speeches were made, wine poured, and Latin mottos repeated for the 1,000th time. But when the night ended and the laughter thinned to nothing, the trilby remained. The guest did not. I asked whether anyone had seen him depart. A shrug was the answer. He had not been at dessert, or so someone thought. Another insisted he had left early, though no one had seen him pass the porter's lodge. I carried the hat to a chair and sat down with it resting on my knee like an unwanted confidant. The label inside bore a name half faded by years of sweat, yet it was not the name I had expected. It was common enough, a sort of name one might encounter in any directory, but still it lodged in my mind with an uneasy persistence. The stitching around the letters was frayed, and there was a faint trace of something white in the lining, chalk dust, perhaps, though the porter denied that his guest had been near the lecture rooms. Lewis arrived, looking tired but dutiful, and asked what I thought. I told him only that men rarely forget their hats unless they intend to. He frowned, as if trying to turn the remark into sense. I did not explain. Deduction is not always a matter of revelation. It is often the slow accumulation of irritations until the mind finds a way to scratch them into coherence. We left the college together, the porter locking the door behind us with a look that suggested relief at handing the matter over. I placed the trilby beneath my arm, its weight curiously significant for something so light. The rain had eased but left the air cool and raw. Students were still awake in their rooms. Laughter carried faintly on the damp air. And yet one man had gone missing into that same night, without witness, without farewell, and without the courtesy of retrieving his hat. I thought of the crossword clue I had abandoned in the tavern. 3 letters, clue given as gone astray. The answer had been obvious once I looked again. Error. And it was in that silence, broken only by the creak of Lewis's shoes on wet stone, that the first flicker of unease settled upon me, the sense that a simple oversight had already become something more than a forgotten hat. Lewis came to me the following morning with the list in his careful hand, the paper folded twice and already creased at the edges. He said he had persuaded the porter to part with it on the grounds that a missing hat could lead to more serious matters. though his voice suggested even he was not fully convinced. I let him lay it on the table beside my cold tea. The names, of course, were familiar in that Oxford way, titles that carried an air of scholarship, gravitas carefully polished over decades. Two dons from the classics faculty, men whose quarrels over translations had filled more than one common room with smoke and sour wine. A visiting scholar from Vienna, whose English was precise enough to make one distrust the precision. A retired judge, whose life now consisted of telling stories about cases he once presided over, but never truly forgot. And there was one final guest, an ambiguous entry from abroad, written in a hand less steady than the others, as though the porter himself had hesitated before committing the letters to paper. I read the list aloud, slowly, lingering over each syllable as though they were clues hidden within the sounds themselves. Lewis listened with the patience of a man accustomed to my meandering ways, though I sensed his doubt. He asked whether I saw anything unusual. I told him only that names are never as innocent as they appear. He frowned, waiting for explanation. I gave him none. It was the third name that unsettled me, not for its novelty, but for its familiarity. Too familiar. I recalled it from somewhere else, though I could not at once say where. It whispered at the edge of memory like the faint residue of a perfume in an empty corridor. I folded the paper again and slipped it into my pocket, murmuring something about Chaucer's pilgrims and their habit of traveling under guises not their own. Lewis looked at me as though I were once again speaking in riddles. Perhaps I was. The morning was damp, with rain clinging to the glass in droplets that trembled but never fell. I sat by the window, hat still on the chair beside me, and traced the lettering inside the brim with my thumb. Hats, I reflected, are peculiar things. They accompany us to the most ordinary and the most solemn of occasions. They absorb sweat, rain, even the faint salt of grief. To forget one was to forget a part of oneself. And yet here we were, with a hat present, but a man absent. Lewis suggested we interview the guests as soon as possible before their memories hardened into something less pliable. I agreed in principle, but asked first that he return to the porter and have the register read aloud once more. I wanted to hear the rhythm of the names, the pauses, the hesitations, not merely see the letters on a page. There is often more truth in the manner of saying than in the thing said. He gave me a look that balanced between obedience and exasperation. I said nothing more, only pointed to the crossword abandoned on the table. The clue was 6 letters, definition given as one who stays when others depart. I had written in remnant with a question mark beside it. It seemed fitting. When Lewis had gone, I leaned back and let the college bells toll the hour. The sound filled the room with its ancient melancholy. Somewhere among those names, among those carefully recorded guests, was the beginning of a deception, and though I had no proof, only the faintest tug of memory. I knew that the list itself was a trail, one that would lead not to the absent hat, but to the absent man. I poured myself a measure of whiskey, though it was scarcely noon, and thought of the Chaucer line that drifted unbidden into my head, and specially from every shire's end, of Engelond to Canterbury they wend. A journey made in company, though each traveller carried secrets of their own, and one of them, I suspected, had not yet returned. Dawn in Oxford has a habit of arriving half-formed, as if the light itself were reluctant to disturb the stone. That morning the mist hung low over the Cherwell, muting the outlines of punts and willows until they seemed half-drawn sketches. It was Lewis who woke me with the news, his voice carrying a gravity that told me this was no mere case of a man mislaying his hat. The body lay on the bank, where the grass gave way to mud. The constables had already stretched a cordon, though the river itself paid little attention. It lapped quietly at the edges of the scene, as though rehearsing an erasure. The man was face down at first, coat sodden, hair matted to his scalp. When they turned him, the river released him with a sigh. His face was ordinary, not young, not old. the kind that could pass unnoticed at any gathering. There was no wallet, no papers, nothing that tied him to a life elsewhere. Only a letter folded twice and soaked until the ink blurred, retrieved from the inside pocket by a constable with gloved hands. Lewis read the words aloud, haltingly, a verse about evening and silence, attributed to Wordsworth. But the line, I knew at once, was not Wordsworth's. It belonged to Gray, a minor error, perhaps, but in such errors one sometimes finds the edge of truth. I let the thought linger, saying nothing. The assumption, of course, was immediate. The hat left behind in the cloakroom must have belonged to this man, and the river had kept him for a few hours before surrendering him back to us. Even the porter, summoned and pale with shock, said yes. He thought it might be the same fellow. Yet something pressed against me, a resistance not unlike the stubborn crossword clue that refuses to yield. I crouched beside the body, ignoring the damp that crept through my trousers. My eyes fell to the shoes. Black leather, polished to a gleam that spoke of recent care. It jarred against the river mud that clung to the laces. A man who takes such pains with his shoes does not wander carelessly into water. I noticed, too, the tie, knotted in the foreign style, a half-Windsor that I had seen more often abroad than among Englishmen of his apparent years. The knot sat neatly, almost too neatly, as if prepared with deliberate care. Lewis remarked that the river often played tricks, that bodies shift, belongings are lost, appearances altered by water. I nodded, but my eye returned to the man's hands. The nails were trimmed, yes, but beneath them no trace of soil or grass, no desperate clutching at earth in his final moment. Death had come quietly, it seemed, and then the river had been made to bear witness. The letter troubled me most of all. To carry a line of poetry, misattributed, was curious enough. To carry it folded with such precision, in a coat pocket otherwise empty, suggested intention. It was not an accident that this fragment alone survived. I asked the constable for the envelope, but there was none. Only the page itself, with its blurred ink and deliberate error. Lewis asked whether I thought it suicide. I told him no, though I could not yet say why. Perhaps it was the shoes, perhaps the tie, perhaps the stubborn fact that a man who remembered poetry did not forget the poet's name by chance. Something here was staged, though the play itself remained unseen. The mist lifted slightly, revealing the spire of Magdalen in the distance. I thought how often Oxford dressed death in civility, how the past was always waiting beneath its surfaces. This body, lying so politely by the river, seemed another layer of the same performance. We left him there for the coroner, the hat still in my keeping. I carried it under my arm as though it might answer for him, but it did not. It only weighed heavier with each step, a silent reminder that the man by the river and the man who had left his trilby might not, after all, be the same. Something was off. I felt it like a faint discord in a piece of music. Quiet, but once heard, impossible to forget. We began our slow procession through the list, Lewis and I, calling on those who had gathered at St. Barnabas that damp evening. One by one they received us in rooms that smelled of polish and paper, and one by one they offered explanations as carefully rehearsed, as if the dinner had been staged for this very aftermath. The first was a Don whose hands trembled slightly as he poured tea. He spoke of translations, of rivalries over chairs and lectureships that stretched back decades, his voice rising with the brittle fervor of a man who had spent too long fighting battles no one else remembered. He said he had left early, that indigestion had driven him home. I watched the way he held his cup, thumb pressed too hard against porcelain, and wondered whether he realized his story was too polished, like the shoes of the man by the river. The retired judge came next. His house was heavy with silence, curtains drawn though the morning was pale and clear. He told us he had enjoyed the dinner, spoken at length with the foreign guest, and then walked home by the high street. I asked whether he had noticed the man who failed to return for his hat. He hesitated. An imperceptible flicker, but there. He said he could not recall. Judges, I thought, were skilled at remembering only what suited the case. The visiting scholar from Vienna greeted us in a room of books stacked in precarious towers. His English was meticulous, each phrase turned as if weighed for accuracy. He claimed to have spoken little that evening, to have found the company too parochial. Yet his eyes brightened when he spoke of poetry, and when I asked if he recognized the line found on the dead man, he quoted it correctly and gave me the right poet's name without hesitation. His tone carried no pride, only inevitability, as though truth itself were a language he could not mistranslate. There was also the widow, a woman of calm bearing whose grief seemed polished to the same smoothness as her pearls. She said the dinner had been unremarkable, the company civil if somewhat tedious. Then, almost as an afterthought, she mentioned hearing a whistle in the quadrangle as she left, a brief tune, uncertain, like someone recalling half a song. No one else, she added, had remarked upon it. Lewis looked at me for confirmation, but I said nothing. A whistle could mean anything, or nothing. Still, I wrote a note in my book. At each house the same pattern emerged. Polite evasions, fragments of memory too neat to be believed. They spoke of appointments lost, inheritances contested, liaisons never spoken aloud but felt in the air like faint smoke. Oxford lives were always stitched with jealousies, and every guest seemed bound by some thread of rivalry or regret. By the time we returned to the station, my notebook was crowded with contradictions. Lewis asked me what I made of it. I told him only that suspicion was like smoke in Oxford. It clung to every stone and curtain, but rarely showed where the fire lay. He muttered that everyone had an alibi of sorts. I said that alibis, like poems, depended on interpretation. Later, in the quiet of my office, I turned to the trilby once more in my hands and thought of the whistle the widow had heard, a sound no one else recalled, a sound that might have marked presence, or absence, or simply imagination. I opened the crossword from that morning, stared at a clue I had left unfinished. Absent friend, 4 letters. I wrote the answer slowly, letting the ink settle into the paper. Gone. And as I closed the book, I felt that the hat, the letter, the polished shoes, all of it was still pointing towards someone who had been among us, and yet not. Someone who lingered like a faint tune in the quadrangle, heard once and then lost to silence. The letter refused to leave me. That blurred scrap of paper, salvaged from the river, with its words clinging stubbornly to meaning despite the water's attempt to erase them. A single misattribution, Wordsworth's name where Gray's should have stood, sat in my mind like grit in a shoe. Many would have dismissed it as the kind of mistake made by students, lovers, or drunks. I could not. I took myself to the Bodleian, where the air always smelled faintly of dust and the oil of bindings, as though scholarship itself had an odor. Rain tapped against the high windows, muffled by centuries of stone, and the place was near deserted, save for a young assistant shelving with the exaggerated care of the inexperienced. I asked him for the anthologies of English verse, those printed in the interwar years, when scholarship still believed itself infallible. He looked faintly surprised, then guided me into a narrow aisle where the spines leaned together like old men whispering. I pulled volumes down one after another, turning pages with hands that had grown unsteady over the years, but had never lost their patience. The poems were all there, arranged as though eternity might be indexed. Wordsworth, Gray, Tennyson, the same names repeated in the same dusty order. I read until the words themselves blurred into cadence. Then, halfway through a battered anthology with cracked leather corners, I found it, the line, identical to the one on the letter, attributed to Wordsworth in careless certainty. What held me, though, was not the error. It was the margin. A hand, elegant but hurried, had written a note in blue-black ink. The same verse, underlined once, with the comment, "He always loved this line." The writing was unmistakable. I had seen it only days before on an RSVP to the alumni dinner, signed by one of the very guests Lewis and I had interviewed. I carried the book to a reading desk where the light was stronger, and I let my eyes linger on the curve of the letters. To mistake Gray for Wordsworth in private scribbling was forgivable. To carry that error into a letter folded into the pocket of a dead man was something else. When I mentioned this to Lewis later that day, his brow furrowed in the familiar way. The guest swore he had never read the poet in question, that poetry was a pastime of others, not himself. He had smiled with the smug detachment of a man who thought his alibi lay in disdain. And yet here was his hand, captured in a margin years earlier, betraying not only familiarity, but affection. I felt a tightening in my chest, not triumph, but unease. We returned to the library office, where a register of borrowings was kept with the kind of rigor only Oxford could justify. The assistant produced it reluctantly, perhaps sensing the gravity we placed on so small a thing. I asked that the volume be checked quietly, without alerting the name I already suspected. Who, I asked, had most recently taken it from the shelves? The assistant promised to inquire, though his glance carried both caution and curiosity. Walking back through Radcliffe Square, I considered the nature of small errors. To misplace a hat, to knot a tie differently, to ascribe a line of verse to the wrong poet. Each one trivial, yet together they began to form a shadow. The truth, I thought, is rarely hidden by invention. It is betrayed by carelessness. Lewis, trudging beside me, asked why it mattered. I told him that a man may lie to protect himself, but handwriting rarely conspires in the same way. He asked if I thought we had found our killer. I shook my head. We had found a contradiction, nothing more. Contradictions are the currency of Oxford. They buy nothing, but they keep men talking. That evening, I poured myself a whiskey and opened the crossword. 7 letters, where truth hides. I wrote the answer, paused, then crossed it out. I had written library. Too neat, too easy. The truth does not hide in libraries. It hides in men and in the spaces between what they claim to have forgotten. The retired judge received us in a drawing room that smelled faintly of furniture polish and the hushed weight of old carpet. Heavy curtains dimmed the light, though a fire burned stubbornly in the grate despite the season. He motioned for Lewis and me to sit, his movements measured as though he was still on the bench, every gesture requiring deliberation. Lewis began with the usual courtesy. He asked about the dinner at St. Barnabas, the names, the conversation, the impression left by the absent guest. The judge listened with the slow patience of a man long accustomed to hearing others speak before deciding how much to reveal. His voice, when it came, was dry as paper and not without authority. The man who failed to collect his hat, he said, had come to him before the dinner, not for pleasantries, but for advice. A delicate matter, he called it. A trial from years ago, one that had ended with whispers of fraud and an altered will. Lewis's pencil scratched faintly on his pad, though I doubted the notes would capture the nuances the judge so carefully let slip and withheld. He spoke of the case with an odd detachment, as though describing another man's judgment. Yet in his tone there lingered a certain defensiveness, a reminder that even retired men fear the long reach of their past decisions. The missing man had not asked for detail, only whether silence could still be relied upon after so many years. The judge had answered, carefully, that memory often fades, but not always, and that was the end of it. I let Lewis continue his questions, times, faces, whether the man seemed agitated or calm. The judge replied with composure, sipping at a glass of sherry that trembled only slightly in his hand. My attention wandered from his words to the painting above the mantelpiece. A fox hunt, the riders frozen in mid-gallop, the hounds' mouths open in silent cry. The picture struck me as strangely triumphant for such a solemn room. The pursuit immortalized, but never the exhausted animal at its center. When the account seemed exhausted, I asked a question of my own, one that startled Lewis enough to glance at me sidelong. I asked the judge about hats. Did the man wear one? Had he always? The judge blinked, then smiled faintly at the oddity of the inquiry. Always the same one, he replied, a trilby of no great quality, but of unmistakable familiarity. He had worn it for years, almost as if it were a badge. The judge recalled it as clearly as he recalled his own robes. I nodded, staring back at the fox hunt, my mind elsewhere. The trilby sat heavy in my memory, the torn lining with its faint trace of chalk or dust, the stitching frayed beyond repair. A man who wore the same hat always would not fail to notice its absence, nor would he abandon it willingly. If he did, it meant intention or substitution. Lewis asked about the altered will, but the judge declined, his lips closing like a door on hinges still oiled. It was all long ago, he said. Better left to the archives. He rose then, signaling the end of our visit, his frailty hidden beneath layers of formality. As we stepped out into the pale afternoon, Lewis muttered about evasions and half-truths. I said nothing. My thoughts were with the trilby and the man who had worn it. Always the same one, the judge had said. Yet the hat in my keeping seemed suddenly not to belong, its torn seam whispering a story quite different from constancy. On the walk back, the crossword clue from the previous day returned to me. 4 letters, absent friend. I had written, gone. But perhaps the better answer was, lost. Oxford has always been a city of whispers. Rumour slips more easily through cloisters than sunlight, and it was through such a whisper that we first heard of the Don's affair. Lewis brought it to me with a mixture of reluctance and excitement, as if repeating a confidence he scarcely believed, yet could not keep to himself. One of the Dons, respected, grey at the temples, had for some years pursued a liaison with the widow of his late colleague. It was said that the affair was not merely rumour, but fact, witnessed in glances too long held in evenings when her curtains closed earlier than usual. The story might have remained a harmless piece of academic gossip had it not been for the quarrel. Several guests confirmed that on the night of the dinner, voices had risen in the antechamber, the Don and the widow, their dispute audible through the thin oak panel. Words were muffled, but anger carries its own frequency. A guest swore he had heard the word betrayal. Another thought he caught the widow's voice break into sobs. They emerged, eventually with composure regained, but Oxford eyes miss little, and tongues sharpen in silence. Lewis saw in it a clear motive: jealousy, resentment, perhaps even blackmail. He spoke with the fervor of a man convinced at last that the shadows had yielded shape. The dead man by the river might have known of the affair, might have threatened exposure, or he had simply been caught between their quarrel, collateral in a passion too long suppressed. I half believed it myself. The Don was not a man one instinctively trusted. His voice, when we visited, carried the arrogance of intellect, and his eyes darted too readily from detail to detail, as though calculation were his only defense. He admitted to knowing the widow well, too well, perhaps, but denied any impropriety. He dismissed the overheard quarrel as a misunderstanding, an elevated discussion of faculty politics. Yet the denial was too neat, too dismissive, as if rehearsed in anticipation. We pressed him further, and his composure thinned. He admitted that he had walked the widow home that night, though he insisted it was only courtesy. He could not recall the precise hour. Lewis, triumphant, produced the record of a train ticket purchased that very evening in the Don's name for a late journey to London. Why, Lewis asked, would a man buy a ticket if he intended to walk a widow home? The Don faltered. His explanation was unconvincing, that he had intended to travel, but changed his mind, preferring companionship to solitude. It sounded plausible enough, and for a few hours I let myself consider it as truth. It was the kind of narrative detectives are meant to relish. Passion, jealousy, betrayal, all tidily contained within the boundaries of human weakness. And yet, a single contradiction unsettled the picture. I studied the ticket carefully. It was for a train departing at 9:15. The dinner had run late, speeches dragging into tedium, dessert served well after 10. If the Don had planned to leave, he had planned to abandon the dinner long before the quarrel, long before any alleged betrayal. The ticket had been purchased too early to serve as evidence of guilt. It was, in fact, evidence of something else, his intention to be elsewhere entirely. When I pointed this out, Lewis frowned, unwilling to relinquish so satisfying a culprit. But satisfaction is rarely truth. The Don might have been deceitful, might even have pursued the widow with indiscretion, but the river had not claimed its body on account of his desire. His motives, tangled as they were, did not fit the careful knot of the tie, the polished shoes, the folded letter of misattributed verse. We left him in his study, the widow's photograph discreetly framed on his desk, her eyes turned away from the camera as if in perpetual refusal. I walked back through the drizzle, feeling more hollow than relieved. The neat solution had unraveled, not with drama, but with arithmetic. A train time misaligned, a sequence that refused to bend to passion's convenience. At home that night, with the crossword before me, I filled in a clue I had ignored for days. 6 letters, deceptively convincing. I wrote the word specious and underlined it twice. It seemed the most accurate description of what we had just uncovered, an affair, an argument, a motive so near to plausible, yet as empty as the river's silence. The foreign guest had been spoken of often, and always in tones that carried the faintest trace of suspicion. He had arrived late to the dinner, his accent difficult to place, his papers, so Lewis insisted, irregular in one small but troubling way. He seemed to know Oxford well enough, but the kind of knowledge he displayed was second-hand, the sort of thing one acquires from guidebooks and postcards rather than lived familiarity. He knew the names of the colleges, but stumbled over their locations. He praised the Radcliffe camera, yet called it a library in the wrong century. Small errors, yet Oxford thrives on small errors. Lewis believed him involved. He said it was always the stranger, the man whose history could not be traced, whose connections were tenuous at best. The foreign guest had spoken little during the evening, had kept mostly to himself, had smiled too readily when spoken to. In Lewis's view, silence was as damning as any quarrel. We visited him in the rooms he had been lent, a set of chambers on the high street above a tobacconist. The place smelled faintly of stale smoke and foreign tobacco. He welcomed us politely, almost nervously, as if anticipating interrogation. His English was precise but lacking idiom, each phrase balanced too carefully. He said he had been delighted to attend the dinner, honored to meet such distinguished scholars, though when pressed he could recall almost nothing of what had been said, nor by whom. He remembered the menu in detail, but forgot the name of the man who had sat at his side. Lewis grew more convinced with every hesitation. He asked about the papers, why his passport bore a stamp out of sequence, why his residence permit was so recently obtained. The man fumbled an explanation about clerical errors, offices in Vienna or perhaps in Prague, matters lost in translation. He looked to me for sympathy, but I gave him none. I merely observed. On his desk lay a copy of the Times, folded at the crossword. I sat down, uninvited, and studied the grid. Several clues half filled, many left blank. A man who claimed scholarship, I thought, yet he faltered at the most English of puzzles. I wrote in an answer without asking, a simple word he had overlooked. He watched me with a kind of awe, as though I had performed a conjuring trick. It told me what I needed to know. He was no killer, A killer in Oxford would have known too much. Too much of our habits, our libraries, our ways of disguising malice beneath civility. This man knew too little. His ignorance betrayed him far more effectively than guilt ever could. As we left, Lewis muttered that he was certain the fellow was hiding something. I told him we are all hiding something, but not always the same thing. He pressed me, asked why I dismissed him so easily. I answered only with the crossword clue I had just filled. 5 letters without knowledge. I had written naive. The foreign guest faded from my thoughts soon after. He would return abroad, no doubt, carrying with him memories of Oxford's reign and suspicion. His presence in the story was like the shadow of a cloud across a quadrangle, noticed, commented upon, then gone, leaving the stone unchanged. Back in my rooms that evening, I unfolded the crossword once more. The foreigner's handwriting clung faintly to the page, hesitant letters in half-guessed words. I almost felt a pang of regret. He had been drawn into our pattern not by guilt, but by difference. And difference in Oxford is always an invitation for mistrust. I returned to St. Barnabas on a morning too clear for comfort. Oxford does not wear brightness well. Its stones prefer the melancholy of drizzle. The porter received me with the weary patience of a man who knew already that I would not be satisfied. He fetched the trilby from its resting place as if producing evidence in a trial no jury had been impaneled to hear. I carried it back into the lodge, away from the sun, and placed it on the desk before me. The hat had become an old companion by then, but one I had never looked at closely enough. I traced my fingers along the felt, the crown worn thin where a man's touch had repeated itself over years. I lifted the lining, and it was then that I saw it. Faint, nearly dissolved by sweat and time, an inscription sewn into the silk. The letters were not clear, but enough remained to form a name. And it was not the name of the man lying by the chair-well. It belonged, unmistakably, to another of the dinner guests, one who had sat 2 places down from the widow, speaking quietly of nothing while dessert cooled. The revelation did not arrive like thunder. It came instead as a dull ache, a recognition that all along I had been listening to the wrong voice in the choir. The dead man might have worn the hat that night, but it was not his. He had borrowed it, or been given it, or perhaps forced into it. And the hat, left behind in the cloakroom, had been intended as a signature, not of presence, but of misdirection. Lewis, when I told him, frowned in the way he always did when deduction strayed from the tangible. He said it proved nothing. A man might buy a hat second-hand, inherit it from a cousin, find it at a jumble sale. I agreed with him aloud, but in silence I dismissed it. Oxford men do not inherit each other's hats. They cling to them as they cling to their degrees, as they cling to the long memory of grievance. The porter confirmed what I suspected without knowing he had done so. Yes, he remembered the hat on the man who had not returned. Yes, it had looked right upon him, though he could not say why. But he also remembered, reluctantly, that the same trilby had hung in the lodge many times before, over many dinners. Always the same hook, always the same hand, lifting it away at the night's end. That hand, however, had belonged not to the dead man, but to another still walking Oxford streets. I felt the case turn upon itself like a mirror suddenly reversed. The river body was not the owner of the hat, but the victim of its convenience. To leave behind another man's trilby was to invite confusion, to create in absence a presence that could not be questioned. Whoever had arranged it wanted us to believe the dead man and the hat were indivisible, that identity could be as easily assumed as a garment. The hat's lining was torn slightly at the seam, and in the tear I found a trace of chalk. Perhaps from a college lecture room, perhaps from nothing at all. Yet it seemed to me like the faintest signature of intention, proof that the hat had lived a life its wearer no longer could claim. That night I sat with the crossword, staring at a clue I had once left blank. 9 letters, a mistaken identity. The answer revealed itself now without effort. Masquerade. I wrote it in slowly, the ink spreading through the paper like water through cloth. I closed the book and poured a whiskey. For the first time, I felt the shape of the crime settling around me. It was not about a man who forgot his hat. It was about a man who borrowed another's, and in doing so, took his place in death. The case had inverted itself, and everything I thought I knew stood suddenly on its head. The trilby sat on the desk beside me, mute, faithful, and treacherous. It was Lewis who brought me the photograph, though he did not at first grasp its weight. He said it had been found in one of the college archives, a drawer long neglected, where old photographs curled and browned in the silence of paper. He handed it across my desk as though it were another piece of routine evidence. I studied it under the dim lamp. A group of young men, arranged stiffly in their gowns, their expressions the mixture of pride and discomfort that photographs of that era so often capture. The edges of the card had faded, the ink inscription at the bottom scarcely legible. Yet even in their youth, the faces were unmistakable. Two of the alumni who now insisted, with practiced certainty, that they had never known each other. And between them, seated with casual confidence, was the man who now lay in the coroner's keeping, pulled from the chair well like so much river weed. The sight unsettled me more than I let Lewis see. For weeks we had been listening to the careful accounts of men who lived by memory, whose alibis were fortified with half-truths and omissions. Now, here they were, shoulder to shoulder, the lens capturing what words had denied. I traced my finger along the faded ink until I made out the words, Trinity College, 1957. Beneath it, almost lost to time, another note in a different hand. Our venture, our fortune, our silence. Lewis leaned over my shoulder, muttering that it sounded like some schoolboy pact. But I heard in the phrasing something darker, a contract forged not in innocence but in complicity. Silence is rarely innocent in Oxford. It is cultivated, rehearsed, handed down. I asked Lewis to leave me with the photograph. Alone, I stared again at their faces. Youthful, yes, but already etched with the lines of entitlement, the certainty that the world would bend to them. And the man now dead, his gaze direct, amused, as though he already foresaw the years when secrets would ferment into leverage. I thought of the judge's story, of the trial that had hinted at fraud and an altered will. I thought of the hushed tones with which the widow had spoken of betrayal, and now here, captured in sepia, was the seed of it, a financial scandal buried beneath decades of ritual dinners and polite denials. A debt unpaid, a silence maintained, until one man found use for its breaking. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. Outside, the bells of Saint. Mary struck the hour, the sound as steady and inexorable as time itself. I closed my eyes and tried to summon their words from the interviews, the denials, the casual claims of ignorance. Each one now a lie that the photograph had unmasked. When Lewis returned, I asked him quietly to confirm who had last handled the archives. He looked puzzled but agreed. I wanted to know who had tried to keep this photograph hidden, who had left it where only dust was meant to find it. That evening, alone with a whiskey, I turned the trilby once more in my hands. A hat, a letter, a photograph. Objects that had outlived their owners, carrying fragments of truth in silence. The inscription haunted me most. Our venture, our fortune, our silence. The words belonged less to students than to conspirators. In the crossword, a clue lingered unfinished. 5 letters, a bond not broken. I wrote the word oath, then crossed it out. Better, I thought, to leave it blank. Some bonds were not oaths, but shackles, and their breaking could only end in death. The chapel at St. Barnabas was a place I rarely visited. Its air always seemed too still, as though the stones themselves had conspired to muffle sound. That evening it was dark, candles guttering against the draught, the faint smell of wax and age lingering in the rafters. I had asked for the meeting there deliberately. Confession, if it was to come, required silence, and silence was what those walls were built to hold. He was waiting when I entered, seated in the second pew, hands folded, eyes fixed on the altar as though prayer might still absolve him. He turned when I sat beside him, though without surprise. It was as if he had known for some time that I would come. I told him what I had pieced together, the photograph, the inscription, the threads of history woven into that single evening by the river. He did not interrupt, did not protest. Only when I spoke the name of the dead man did his lips tighten, as if bracing against an old wound reopened. He said at last, softly, that it had never been about money. Greed was too crude a motive, too vulgar. It had been about love once, or something near enough to it. An affair, long buried, that had threatened reputations when reputations were all they possessed. The dead man had held the secret like a blade, unsheathed at last with the promise of ruin. He had not sought payment, only power, the cruel satisfaction of reminding others that the past was never past. I asked him if sorrow justified murder. He shook his head. Nothing justified it. He had acted not with calculation, but with despair, cornered by memory, by the weight of a mistake made decades earlier. He said he had not meant for the river to take him, only to silence him long enough to preserve what little remained of dignity. But silence, once invoked, has a way of becoming permanent. The chapel swallowed his words, rendering them almost indistinguishable from prayer. I let the quiet expand between us as though the stones themselves wished to judge. Then he looked at me, and with a calmness that startled me, he quoted the verse found in the dead man's pocket, the very line once misattributed. This time he named the poet correctly. Gray, his voice did not tremble. The words carried the solemn cadence of a man who had rehearsed them in solitude for years. I replied with the same verse, though I placed the weight differently, letting emphasis fall not on death but on remembrance. Meaning, I reminded him without saying, depends less on the poet than on the reader. He closed his eyes, as though the distinction cut deeper than accusation. Lewis waited outside. I had not brought him in. Some conversations cannot survive the blunt edges of report writing. When the man bowed his head at last, it was not with defiance, nor with fear, but with the weary relief of one who no longer needed to lie. He said only that he would go quietly, that Oxford had taken enough noise from him already. We walked together out of the chapel. The night had settled in, the quad empty, the stones glistening with the remnants of rain. I thought, not for the first time, how sorrow can live longer than any crime, how reputations mean less than the silence they demand. Back in my rooms, I found the crossword untouched from the morning, 7 letters, to yield without force. I filled it in slowly, consent, then I closed the book. Some puzzles, I thought, solved themselves not in triumph but in resignation. I sat alone in the corner of the Jericho Tavern, the trilby no longer with me, but its shadow still occupying the chair across the table. Lewis had come with me at first, but left after a single pint, muttering something about his wife, about supper waiting. He had tried, before he went, to persuade me that the case was closed, that all that remained was the paperwork. He never understood how closure in Oxford was always an illusion, the surface neat while the undercurrents went on shifting. The pint before me was dark, untouched beyond its first taste. My throat was dry, but I felt no thirst. I kept thinking of the hat, how it had hung in the porter's lodge, how we had treated it as a mistake, a lapse of memory, when in truth it was neither. It had not been forgotten. It had been left behind, deliberately, almost ceremonially. A signal of absence as loud as any presence. The man who once owned it had ensured that silence would speak for him long after his voice was gone. Lewis's words lingered. He had said that the hat meant nothing, that people forget things every day. But Lewis had the pragmatism of a man content with surfaces. He had never understood how Oxford trades in symbols, how a misplaced book or a misquoted poet can carry weight enough to ruin lives. The Trilby was no different. It had been the cipher of the whole affair, its empty place on the hook as telling as the empty seat at the dinner table. Outside, Broad Street had shaken itself free of rain. Students moved in laughing clusters, scarves trailing, their voices rising brightly into the night air. They belonged to a different Oxford, the one that trusted in youth, in futures still unspoiled. I envied them a little. They would pass the porter's lodge without a second thought, never guessing what secrets had hung upon its wooden pegs. I unfolded the crossword from my pocket, its creases soft from overuse. One last clue waited, the grid nearly complete. 4 letters. Absent friend. I stared at it for some time, letting the noise of the pub recede into a dull hum. The answer had been with me from the beginning, though I had resisted writing it. I let the pen linger over the squares, then at last I wrote it in, slowly, carefully. Gone. The words seemed to settle into the paper as if it belonged there, the way certain truths finally accept themselves. I closed the puzzle book, slid it back into my coat. My glass remained unfinished, the beer gone flat. I had no appetite for it. The room smelled faintly of spilt ale and fried onions, the kind of ordinary odor that insists the world continues no matter who has vanished from it. When I left, the air outside was sharp with the freshness that follows rain. The stones gleamed faintly under the lamps, their centuries indifferent to one more death, one more sorrow, hushed into silence. I walked past the students, their laughter echoing off walls older than their country of birth, and thought how Oxford itself was an empty seat, always waiting for the next man to take his place, always remembering those who no longer returned. I reached my rooms without hurry, the crossword folded again in my pocket, the word gone echoing against my thoughts like a refrain. Some cases end not with revelations, but with absence, with a space no evidence can fill. The Trilby had told me that from the beginning, though I had been too slow to listen. I poured myself a whiskey, but did not drink it. The glass caught the lamplight, amber and still, another empty seat at the table of the night.